He walked into that grand lecture hall, not as a student, not as a scholar, but as a janitor, invisible to everyone else. The sound of his mop gliding across the marble floor echoed against walls lined with the names of geniuses, men who changed the world with equations and theories. But for him, those names were reminders of what he was never meant to be. To the students, he was just another worker, a shadow who cleaned up after brilliance. To the professors, he was background noise. And yet, behind those quiet eyes, something extraordinary slept. Something the world had no idea was about to wake. It started on a gray morning. The lecture hall buzzed with laughter as a young professor scribbled a monstrous equation across the board. His voice carried arrogance, the kind that comes from knowing the world already bows to you. "Solve this," he said, smirking at the sea of privileged faces before him. "Anyone who can solve this deserves a genius grant, or maybe even my hand in marriage." The room erupted in laughter. In the corner, the janitor paused. His fingers trembled around the handle of his mop. That equation, it wasn't just numbers and symbols to him. It was memory, the kind that burned deep, born from years of struggle, from a past no one ever cared to ask about. For a moment, he stood still, the laughter echoing around him like thunder. He knew he shouldn't care. He knew he should finish his shift, clock out, and go back to the small, dim room where he spent every night wondering what life could have been. But something in that equation, something in that professor's mocking tone, broke through his silence. He picked up a piece of chalk. The room fell still. Even the laughter seemed to choke in midair. The man who'd been invisible a moment ago now stood at the board, his old janitor's shirt stained, his hands calloused, his eyes fixed on the impossible. For 10 long seconds, no one moved. Then, the sound of chalk scraping the board filled the room. Smooth, confident, unstoppable. The professor's smirk faded. The students whispered. The janitor's hand didn't shake. It moved like it remembered every number, every rule, every secret of that equation. And then he stopped, dropped the chalk, walked away. No words, no explanations, just silence. The professor stared at the board, at the solution that shouldn't have been possible, and his face turned pale. Because what he saw wasn't just a solved equation. It was proof that genius could wear any skin, any uniform, and come from any background, even the one everyone thought didn't belong there. But who was this man? And what story brought him to that moment, from a life of silence to the front of that board? The truth behind that equation would shake the walls of that university forever. Because sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who hold the answers we fear the most. Before that day, before the chalk, before the laughter turned to silence, he was just James Carter, the night janitor at Harlow University, a name barely spoken, a man barely seen. His shift began when the lights dimmed and the world of intellect went home to rest. When the last lecture ended and the last echo of applause faded, that was when James appeared, with a bucket, a mop, and a quiet dignity no one noticed. Every night, he moved through those empty corridors lined with portraits of white men in suits, deans, mathematicians, laureates, men celebrated for brilliance and discovery. Their eyes followed him, framed in gold, as if reminding him that this world belonged to them, not to him. James had learned long ago that silence was safer than being seen. It wasn't always that way. There was a time when he was the one holding the chalk, back in high school, when numbers came to him like second nature. Teachers said he had a gift. Equations spoke to him the way words spoke to poets. But dreams don't survive easily in places where skin color writes your destiny before you do. He'd been told, politely and persistently, that his place wasn't in the classroom. "You're bright," they said, "but maybe focus on something practical." When scholarship applications vanished mysteriously, when recommendations were lost, and when opportunities were handed to others less qualified but more acceptable, James learned the quiet art of endurance. Life became smaller. A series of closed doors and whispered reminders that genius means nothing when the world refuses to see it. Still, every night at Harlow, he cleaned the very spaces he once dreamed of learning in. The irony stung, but there was something sacred about those halls. He would pause at the blackboards after classes ended, eyes tracing the complex symbols left behind by students who didn't know the weight of privilege they carried. Sometimes, he'd solve their unfinished equations in his mind, tiny act of rebellion he never spoke of. One night, long before the infamous lecture, James found a torn notebook left behind in the trash. It belonged to a freshman struggling through advanced calculus. The boy's scribbles were messy, desperate, but familiar. James couldn't help himself. He took the notebook home, corrected the mistakes, and solved every problem. When he returned it anonymously the next morning, tucked neatly on a desk, the boy's face lit up as though a miracle had occurred. James watched from a distance, hidden, a faint smile crossing his face. No one ever knew. But in that quiet victory, James felt alive again. Still, the world didn't make space for men like him to dream. Rent was due. Bills stacked up. Racism wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came dressed in politeness, hidden in hiring forms, in the way the cafeteria staff ignored his good mornings, or how security guards double-checked his ID though he'd worked there for years. To the students, he was invisible. To the professors, forgettable. To himself, he was a shadow, until the day he cleaned the lecture hall of Professor Olden Pierce. Pierce was everything James could have been in another life, young, celebrated, arrogant. The kind of man who believed intelligence was his birthright. He taught advanced theoretical mathematics, filling holes with confidence and contempt in equal measure. James would linger near the doorway sometimes, pretending to adjust equipment just to listen. The equations fascinated him. The patterns, the logic, the perfection hidden beneath chaos. For a few minutes each night, he wasn't a janitor. He was a mathematician again. Then came that morning, a Saturday lecture, open to the public. James was assigned to clean early before the session began. He moved quietly as the students filed in, all bright smiles and wealthy accents, oblivious to the man sweeping in the corner. The board filled with complex symbols, numbers that danced like ghosts from his past. He recognized the equation immediately, a famous unsolved problem. James froze. His heart pounded, not from confusion, but recognition. He had seen it before, not in books, but in dreams, nights when he'd scribbled formulas in the dark only to wake and erase them before anyone noticed. The professor's joke echoed across the hall. "Solve this equation and I'll marry you." The students laughed, clapping, their amusement filling the room. James kept his head down, but something stirred in him, an ache he thought had long died. That equation was his. Years ago, he had been working on it in secret, before life forced him away from textbooks and toward mops and paychecks. He recognized every line, every variable, every choice the professor made, and he saw where it went wrong. He didn't mean to react, but he did. A pause, a breath, a faint tilt of his head. Someone noticed. One of the students snickered. Even the janitors curious, they said, and laughter erupted again. That was a moment, small, almost invisible, when James's quiet world began to crack. He felt shame burn his skin, anger knot his stomach, and something older, deeper, the weight of every time he had been told he wasn't good enough, smart enough, white enough. The equation wasn't just numbers anymore. It was his life written on a board, a puzzle he had been solving since birth. And as he stared at it, surrounded by laughter and ignorance, James made a decision that would change everything. That day, he would no longer clean the remnants of others' brilliance. He would remind the world what brilliance truly looked like. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a man who has been silenced is give him a reason to speak. The days after that lecture were heavy with silence. James went back to work, sweeping those same floors, scrubbing those same hallways, but something inside him had changed. He couldn't stop thinking about that equation. The one that had mocked him, called to him, haunted him. It wasn't just math anymore. It was a mirror of his own life, unsolved, overlooked, dismissed. Every time his mop brushed across the tiles of that grand lecture hall, he saw it again, those chalk marks, those symbols. He began sneaking into classrooms late at night after the students left. The smell of chalk dust filled the air as he stood before the blackboard, alone. Slowly, he began to rewrite the equation from memory. His hands moved with purpose, his heart beat in rhythm with every stroke of chalk. But even in that quiet solitude, the world still found ways to remind him of his place. One night, as James worked, a security guard entered. A tall man in uniform, flashlight in hand. He shined it right in James's eyes. "Buildings closed," the guard said sharply. James explained he was just finishing his shift, But the man's tone didn't soften. I said, "You don't belong here at this hour." The way he said it, not "you don't belong here now," but "you don't belong here, ever," hit harder than the light in his face. James lowered his head. "Yes, sir." He packed up and left. But that night, walking home under flickering streetlights, something burned inside him. Anger, shame, defiance. He started carrying a small notebook in his pocket, scribbling formulas during breaks, solving parts of the equation piece by piece. It was as if every insult, every closed door, every time someone looked through him had condensed into numbers and lines that now finally made sense. Then came the whispers. The next morning, a group of students in the hallway laughed as he passed. "Hey, Professor," one said mockingly, "solve that equation yet?" Their laughter was sharp, cruel, echoing down the marble corridor. James didn't respond, but his silence only fueled them. By the end of the week, the story had spread. The janitor who thought he could do math. Even some of the faculty joined in the quiet ridicule. "Is harmless," one professor said. "A dreamer. Maybe, but he should stick to cleaning, not equations." James heard every word, every snicker that followed him. And yet, every insult became another variable, another part of the equation he was now obsessed with solving, not for fame, not for glory, but for truth. Then came the day everything changed. Late one evening, after hours, James found himself in that same lecture hall again. The lights were dim, the air thick with chalk dust and memory. On the board, someone had rewritten the same equation, as if mocking him. Underneath it, in bold letters, someone had scrawled, "Stay in your lane." The words cut deeper than any insult could. For a long time, he just stared at them. The rage boiled inside, the kind of rage that comes from decades of quiet endurance. Then, slowly, he picked up the chalk. He erased the words, and he began to write. His hand moved faster this time, more sure. His mind was sharp, alive, every number aligned perfectly, every variable found its place. Hours passed like minutes. He worked through fatigue, through pain, through doubt. And when the final symbol fell into place, James stepped back, chest heaving. He had done it. He had solved the unsolvable. For a moment, it felt like redemption, like justice, like the universe itself had finally acknowledged him. But then the door opened. Professor Pierce stood there, eyes narrowing. "What are you doing?" James froze. The chalk slipped from his fingers. Pierce's gaze flicked to the board, then back to James. The air thickened. "This is my classroom," the professor said coldly. "My equation." James tried to explain that he wasn't trying to steal anything, that he had been working on it long before that lecture. But Pierce wasn't listening. His voice rose, filled with condescension and accusation. "You think you can just waltz in here and pretend to understand this? You think cleaning the floors give you the right to touch my work?" James stood still, the words pounding into him like rain on stone. Pierce stepped closer, his tone dropping lower. "No one will believe you solved this. No one will believe you could." The words hit harder than any blow. Because James knew Pierce was right. The world would never believe him. Not the world that had already decided what his intelligence was worth. The next morning, rumors spread again, this time more vicious, more public. The janitor broke into the lecture hall. Someone said, tried to steal Pierce's formula. Another claimed he vandalized the board. By noon, James was summoned by the administration. They didn't ask for his side. They didn't care about explanations. "We can't have this kind of behavior on campus," they said. "You've made students uncomfortable." In a single afternoon, he lost his job. The university security escorted him out the same doors he had mopped clean for years. Students watched from the windows as he walked away, the man who cleaned their classrooms, now erased from the very place he kept spotless. But as James stepped off those steps and into the cold evening air, he didn't feel defeated. Not yet. In his pocket, folded and smudged with chalk dust, was a single piece of paper, the equation. Solved. Complete. Proof of what he had done. He looked back once at the towering building behind him, that monument to knowledge that had always excluded him, and whispered under his breath, "One day they'll see." Because a truth, once written, cannot be erased. And somewhere, deep inside the halls of Harlow University, a storm was already brewing, one that would soon tear down the walls that silence had built. The rain came down hard the next morning, washing the stone steps of Harlow University clean, almost as if the sky itself wanted to erase what had happened. But some stains don't wash away that easily. Inside, the whispers didn't stop. They multiplied. The janitor who broke in, the man who pretended to be a mathematician, the liar, the thief. James sat in his small apartment, the walls thin enough to hear the city outside, the steady hum of life moving on without him. His uniform hung in the corner, still damp from the night before. On his table lay the folded sheet of paper, the equation. Solved. Perfect. His masterpiece. But now it was worthless. No one would ever read it. No one would ever believe it. Because a name written on that paper, James Carter, janitor, was enough for the world to look away. He thought of tearing it up, of letting the rain outside carry away what little pride he had left. But something stopped him. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was a quiet memory of his mother, who once told him, if you let them define you, they'll bury you before you ever live. That night, James made a choice. He returned to the university, not to plead, not to protest, but to be seen. For once. The annual research gala was underway, a glittering event where professors showcased their breakthroughs to donors and press. Inside the grand hall, chandeliers shimmered, wine glasses clinked, and polite laughter filled the air. And at the center of it all stood Professor Alden Pierce, basking in applause as he presented his solution to an equation once deemed unsolvable. James stood in the doorway, soaked from the rain, clutching his folder tight. He watched as Pierce smiled, pointing to the massive projection of the formula behind him, every symbol, every mark, identical to the one James had written days ago. His heart stopped. That was his work, his handwriting, his pattern. Even the mistake he'd intentionally left in the margin, a subtle, harmless trick to identify his own drafts, was there, uncorrected. The audience erupted in applause. Flashbulbs burst like fireworks. Pierce stood taller, soaking in the glory, and in that moment, James felt the full weight of what it meant to be erased. He stepped forward, quietly at first, then more firmly. Heads turned. The laughter died. Pierce's smile faltered. "What are you doing here?" he whispered. James didn't answer. He walked up to the stage, his shoes leaving small puddles behind him. The security guard shifted uneasily, but Pierce motioned for them to wait. He didn't want a scene. James faced him, trembling, not from fear, but from something older and sharper. "That equation," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "You didn't solve it." Gasps rippled through the room. Pierce's face went white. "Excuse me." James reached into his folder and pulled out his original paper, the one smudged with chalk dust and sweat. "This is my work," he said. "You took it." For a long, terrible moment, no one spoke. Then Pierce laughed, a thin, nervous sound. "This is absurd," he said, forcing composure. "Here's a janitor. Look at him. You expect us to believe he—" But the paper in James's hand told another story. The ink was faded, the pages stained, but the date in the corner was unmistakable, days before Pierce's discovery. The same mistake mark, the same handwriting, the same logic trail. Pierce lunged forward, trying to snatch it away, but James pulled back. The audience stirred. A reporter raised a camera. Flash! Another! Flash! And just like that, the lie began to unravel. Pierce shouted over the noise, his polished charm cracking. "His lying! He stole it from my office." James stood still, drenched and exhausted, but unshaken. "You can check the cameras," he said quietly. "I was cleaning the hole. You left your door open. You mocked me. I finished your problem." Silence. The kind that suffocates a room. Pierce looked around, desperate for support, but the crowd's eyes had changed. The same students who once laughed now whispered. The same professors who once ignored James now looked anywhere but at him. In that moment, the truth didn't need defending. It was written all over Pierce's face. The arrogance, the panic, the collapse of a man who believed power was proof of worth. Security stepped forward, unsure of what to do. The university director moved to the stage, murmuring, "Let's handle this privately." But the cameras were already flashing again. Reporters smelled blood. The story had broken free. James didn't stay. He placed a paper on the podium, turned, and walked out, head high for the first time in years. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet earth and freedom. He stood under the streetlight, chest heaving, as thunder rolled far in the distance. Behind him, the chaos grew. Voices shouted. Reporters scrambled. Truth clawed its way into daylight. But as James walked away from the building that had once defined him, something shifted. For the first time, he felt seen. Not by the world, not yet, but by himself. He had faced a machine that erased him, and though he left with nothing, no job, no title, no recognition, he had reclaimed something far greater, his story. Still, the battle wasn't over. The system that silences men like him doesn't crumble overnight. Because while truth may shake walls, injustice builds them back stronger, unless someone keeps pushing. And James Carter was not done pushing. As he disappeared into the rain-soaked night, the question hung heavy in the air. How many other geniuses have been swept away simply because the world refused to see them? The morning after the gala, Harlow University was no longer the same. The story had spread like wildfire. Janitor outsmarts professor. Math department scandal. Institution faces discrimination allegations. Headline painted James Carter's name in bold for the first time in his life, but not out of admiration, out of curiosity. Some called him a hero. Others called him a fraud. But beneath the noise, beneath the opinions and outrage, something undeniable had shifted. The university, a place built on prestige and intellect, had been forced to confront a truth it had long ignored. Brilliance is no color, no title, and no permission slip. James didn't return to campus. He didn't need to. The same institution that had turned him invisible was now drowning in the reflection of its own hypocrisy. Days turned into weeks. Investigations followed. Reporters dug deep. Emails leaked. It became clear that Professor Pierce had indeed stolen James's work. Not just the equation, but even earlier draft that James had unknowingly discarded while cleaning classrooms. Pierce had taken them, refined them, and claimed them as his own. When the truth broke, the university issued a statement. Long, formal, polished. Words like regret, oversight, and commitment to diversity filled the page. But James didn't care for apologies born from exposure. He wasn't interested in revenge. He wanted recognition, not just for himself, but for every voice that had been silenced, every mind dismissed before it had the chance to shine. Reporters begged him for interviews, but he turned them down. The world didn't need another headline. It needed a mirror. One quiet afternoon, James returned to the lecture hall where it all began. The room was empty. Dust floated in the sunlight that streamed through tall windows. The same board still stood at the front. Clean now, but he could almost see the ghost of that old equation in the chalk lines. He walked slowly to the front, running his fingers over the cold surface. For years, this place had represented everything he wasn't allowed to be. Now, it was just a room, no longer powerful, no longer forbidden. He smiled faintly and placed a folded note on the desk. On it, he wrote only 5 words. Genius needs no permission slip. Then he walked away. That night, a student found the note and posted it online. It went viral within hours. People began sharing their own stories of being overlooked, dismissed, underestimated, of teachers who doubted them, of jobs that turned them away because of how they looked or where they came from. James never asked for fame, but his story became something larger than himself, a spark in a conversation that had long been buried under layers of denial. In time, a scholarship was created in his name, the Carter Fellowship for Underrepresented Minds in STEM. It wasn't funded by the university, but by students and alumni who refused to let the moment fade into another trending topic. But the world didn't suddenly become fair. For every James who finally got noticed, there were thousands who still mopped floors in silence, hiding brilliance behind survival. That's the part people don't like to admit. The system doesn't need villains to function, just indifference. The kind that lets laughter echo in lecture halls while genius stands quietly in the corner with a mop. Years later, a documentary crew tracked James down. He was living modestly, teaching math to underprivileged kids in a community center far from the polished halls of Harlow. When asked if he ever regretted not fighting harder for his recognition, he smiled. "Recognition fades," he said, "but impact doesn't. I don't need my name in books. I just need to make sure no one else grows up thinking they are not smart enough because of the color of their skin." That was James, quiet, humble, defiant in his own way. He didn't want a statue or ceremony. He wanted change, because that's a real equation the world still hasn't solved. Talent plus opportunity equals equality. But the numbers never seem to add up. For every genius born into privilege, another is buried under poverty and prejudice. And until we balance that equation, the world will keep losing answers it desperately needs. The story of James Carter isn't just about one man's victory. It's about what happens when brilliance meets a wall built from bias. It's about every voice ignored, every potential wasted, every child who stops dreaming because someone told them they don't belong. So maybe, just maybe, this isn't just a story about a janitor who solved an impossible equation. Maybe it's a reminder that the most dangerous form of racism isn't hatred. It's dismissal. It's the quiet kind, the polite kind, the kind that smiles while it denies you a seat at the table. And maybe, one day, when someone like James walks into a room, mop in hand, brilliance in mind, the world won't laugh. It'll listen. Because every time we ignore the unheard, every time we overlook the unseen, we lose something greater than knowledge. We lose humanity. The camera pans out, the empty lecture hall bathed in light, the chalkboard clean once more. And in the silence, his words echo like a heartbeat. Genius needs no permission slip. Then the narration fades with one final question. How many more James Carters are walking among us, unseen, unheard, and waiting for the world to stop laughing long enough to notice?